I'm back. Mr. Clarke's back. Time to take a look at 15.7, Southeast Asia and the Pacific during the age of imperialism. Some of the key things we'll be looking at today, we'll look at how Europe and the United States began to build colonies in Southeast Asia. We'll explain how imperialism spread to the islands of the Pacific. And we'll look at how Australia and New Zealand achieved independence and self-rule. Why was Southeast Asia an important region during this period of time of the age of imperialism? It was the region in which we had a lot of travel by sea, by ship. These were travel and, more importantly, trade lanes that kind of linked together some of the great trade regions of the time, including India, which was controlled by the British, as well as China, where most European countries in America were trying to open up for trade. 2, which Western nations took control of much of Southeast Asia during the age of imperialism? The Dutch of the Netherlands, Great Britain, and France. 3, who controlled the Spice Islands and Indonesia? So when you think about the Spice Islands in Indonesia, it's this region here. The Dutch controlled the Spice Islands in Indonesia, and the Dutch were kind of an underrated power. They controlled a lot of islands in this region. They even controlled some islands in the Caribbean. There's still a Dutch heritage, and the language and culture is still present in the ABC Islands, which are located in the Caribbean, Aruba, Bonaire, and Curacao. 4, what is the main reason the Dutch and the British colonized Southeast Asia? The Dutch and the British colonized Southeast Asia because they wanted access to trade, they wanted raw materials. The Dutch expected their colonies to produce crops including coffee, indigo, which is a dye for cloth, and spices. The British used the port of Singapore to bring natural resources such as timber and tin to Great Britain. Question 5, what areas did the British control in the Pacific? In B, Pacific, as well as Southeast Asia. The land down under, Australia, Burma, Sarawak, Malaya, and Singapore. 6, why did the French colonize Vietnam? The French colonized what back then was known as Indochina to gain more influence and markets in the region. The French were also responding to the killing of Christian missionaries and their converts in what is today modern-day Vietnam. French Indochina includes Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. 7, how did the unequal treaties that Siam made with Western powers keep independent and free from colonization? Mongkut and the Siamese king used knowledge of the West to negotiate unequal treaties. Western powers were able to reap benefits of trade with Siam without the expense of colonizing the country. The king satisfied the goals of Western powers, and his country escaped colonization. Eight, which nation seized control of the Philippine Islands in the 1500s? Spain. And once again, when you see the cultural heritage in some of these different regions around the world, it's the original colonizing country that kind of leaves behind the culture, the language, things like that. And this includes the fact that the Philippine Islands, they speak Spanish. 9, how did the United States get involved in the Philippines? Spanish forces in Cuba allegedly blew up the American ship, the USS Maine, killing 230 Americans. The United States declared war on Spain and in the process destroyed the Spanish Armada in the Philippines. The Spanish-American War, you'll learn more about that in American history in 10th grade. But when you look at the issue of the Spanish-American War. Basically, the Spanish had a large empire for a long period of time in the Americas, and slowly but surely it was getting picked off, and we saw a lot of revolutionary movements for independence and such throughout Latin America, but a lot of the Caribbean islands are still under the control of Spain, as well as the Philippines and the far Pacific. So during the Spanish-American War, the United States was able to liberate and free from Spanish control Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam. 10 listed causes and effects of Western involvement in the nation focus on how the Filipino rebels felt about imperialism. Cause: Catholic Church gains power. Effects: the Filipinos resist Spanish rule. Rebels back the United States in a war against Spain. Cause: the United States buys the Philippines from Spain. Effects: the Philippines are not granted independence. Filipino rebels battle American forces for their eventual independence. Okay, moving on now to additional Pacific islands. Number 11, why were Western nations interested in the islands of the Pacific? They could provide bases for American, French, and British ships to take on supplies, refuel, and things like that. With Samoa, the United States gained extraterritoriality and a naval station there. 12, why did the Hawaiian Queen Liliuokalani want to reduce the influence of foreigners, particularly American sugar growers in the Hawaiian Islands? She wanted to reduce foreign interest there in order to maintain her power in the islands. This is supported by the fact that she lost power when American sugar growers overthrew her in 1893. Moving on to 13, who discovered Australia? In 1770, English Captain James Cook claimed Australia for Great Britain. And when the British took control in Australia, very similar to when they took control in the Americas, in North America in particular, they just didn't really care about the indigenous people or the natives who lived there. Native Americans were pushed off their land in America, and here the Aborigines, who are the primary people who lived in Australia, were pushed around by the British as well. And you can see a couple different photographs there that you might want to take a look at. First, on the left side there is an Aboriginal tribe, kind of an elder leader, and then some of the younger family members there. And they still live, even today in contemporary times, in very primitive fashion. On the right side there is it's an Aboriginal village that I visited myself back in 2001. You can see me there getting prepared to toss a boomerang. And a lot of the different people who are on our tour group were given the opportunity to throw the boomerang, and I tossed it, and it came back, kind of spun around, came back, and it hit me directly in the face. It was kind of an unfortunate incident, and that might be some of the reasons for the kind of the leftover damage to my face. You might see that from time to time when you're in class or on the Zoom camera. You're seeing me right now. Take a good look. You can probably see some of the damage that occurred from the boomerang hitting me back in the face. I should have caught it, but I didn't. But at least it was a great toss because it did come directly back to me. 15, who were the first groups of white settlers to Australia? How did they fare? Cite evidence. The first group of white settlers to Australia were made up of convicts who were sent there because prisons in England were overcrowded. It was basically a penal colony initially, or a place for prisoners. They did not fare well since they were city dwellers with no farming skills. The second group was made up of free citizens who went there to start new lives, similar to the motivating factors behind why most people came to the American colonies. And they were given land and tools, and they fared better because they found the climate suited to sheep herding and developed a wool industry. 16, why did Australian colonies unite into a Commonwealth? Why was this in Britain's best interest? The Australian colonies were scattered around the continent and united to prevent interference from other European countries. Establishing a Commonwealth countered this threat and helped them to develop. And the British remained the only colonial power in this region. Now on to New Zealand, which is not too far, obviously, from Australia. Often they are collectively referenced together in contemporary times. How was the experience of the Maoris similar to and different from that of the Australian Aborigines? So basically, both are the native groups to those particular countries. Both groups were similar in that settlers treated them poorly and took away their land. The experience was different in that the Aborigines were hunter and gatherers who spread out over the continent, where the Maori were farmers who lived together in more concentrated areas. In both cases, they were determined to keep their land and fought back in fierce land wars with settlers. 18. Why did New Zealanders preserve close ties with the British Empire? New Zealanders were British settlers who wanted to keep close ties to their home country. They gained independence peacefully and had no hostile feelings towards the British. And then finally, the lesson reflection question. Why were the establishment of Asian colonies so important for Western nations in the 1800s? Of course, trade, travel, transportation, bases for refueling stations, all of which were rationales or reasons why those were significant to Western countries. That'll wrap it up for this lesson. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Hope you enjoyed my included photo there of my experience in Australia. By the way, I didn't give you the clarification. The photograph is taken in Cairns, which is in an Australian city that's in the northeastern corner of Australia. And I was very fortunate to visit the Aboriginal village and had a really tremendous experience in Australia. I would certainly recommend that if you ever have the opportunity to visit Australia, that you certainly do so. It's kind of like a trip of a lifetime for me. And I would love to go back again, so maybe it'll be twice in a lifetime, but it's been 20 years since I've been there, so I'm not sure I'll make it back, but it remains on my to-do list moving forward. And until next time, Mr. Clarke is out.